The engineer called his windmill scrap metal. A farmer fixed it in 1 hour and ran it 16 years. The windmill stopped turning in July of 1981. Not slowly, not gradually. One morning it was spinning in a south wind. The next morning it was not. Eldon Markham noticed it from the east pasture fence line on a Tuesday the 14th, while checking wire after a stretch of heat that had cracked the ground in places along the creek bank. He stood looking at the still wheel for a moment, then walked back to the truck. He was 62 years old, had farmed the same 320 acres in Pawnee County, Nebraska since 1958. The land sat south of Pawnee City, mostly flat, with a slight fall toward the timber along the creek on the back edge. The front 160 grew corn. The back 160 carried cattle. It had carried cattle since before Eldon bought it from Rupert Skeel, who had broken the ground there in 1931 and worked it until his knees gave out. The windmill was an Air Motor 702. Rupert had it installed in the spring of 1961 at the southwest corner of the east pasture, where the prevailing south and southwest winds hit without obstruction. The tower stood 33 feet. The wheel was 8 feet across, 14 blades of galvanized steel, original except for 2 replacements in 1967 after a hailstorm came through. The pump casing ran 22 feet below grade into a sandstone aquifer that had never gone dry in 50 years of record. Eldon had depended on that mill to water his cattle for 23 years. He did not call anyone that first week. Climbed the tower on a Saturday morning and tried moving the wheel by hand from the platform, pushing the blade closest to him, feeling for what the resistance told him. The wheel moved, but stiffly, not locked solid, just wrong. He came back down, looked at the brake rope, looked at the gearbox housing, stood there in the heat for a few minutes, went back to the truck and drove to the house. The stock tank in the east pasture was what made the problem concrete. It sat 290 feet from the tower base, gravity fed through a buried pipe connected to the pump discharge. 38 head of Hereford cross cattle used that tank through the grazing season. In July heat, with temperatures running above 100 degrees for the 3rd week straight, those cattle drank 15 to 18 gallons each per day. On a hot afternoon, the 1,100-gallon tank could drop 200 gallons in 2 hours. Eldon started hauling water. He had a 250-gallon poly tank that fit in the bed of his Ford F-250, and he ran trips from the house well to the east pasture. 2 trips twice a week. Each run took about 2 hours, counting fill time and the 12-mile round trip on County Road. The truck burned 1.5 gallons each trip. By the end of July, he had made 8 trips and spent about $28 in diesel and 32 hours of time keeping water in front of cattle that the windmill had watered for free. He talked to no one about it at first. July turned to August. August was hotter. The problem with hauling was not the cost in diesel. It was the calendar. Corn harvest would start in September. Eldon ran the combine himself on the front 160, and Gary, his youngest son, drove for him on custom acres when he finished his own work up near Beatrice. The water hauls would compete with harvest. There were not enough hours in a September day for both. By the end of August, Eldon had made 22 trips. He had spent $62 in diesel. He had put 480 miles on the truck doing nothing but hauling water, 8 miles each direction. The cattle were watered. The mill was still. Gary came down in October after harvest and looked at the tower. He walked around it the same way Eldon had. Said the problem was probably the gearbox. Suggested calling the Nebraska Rural Water Association field office in Columbus. Said they had licensed engineers who did rural site assessments. Eldon said he'd look into it. He called in March of 1982. The woman who answered said there was a 14 to 18-month wait for non-emergency site assessments in Pawnee County. Eldon put his name on the schedule. She said someone would contact him to confirm the appointment. He hauled water through the summer of 1982. The pattern was the same, 2 trips twice a week, in the early morning before the heat built. The poly tank, the county road, the east pasture. By October of 1982, he had made 68 total hauls since July of 1981. He kept a log on the back of an envelope, date, gallons, diesel cost. He did not throw the envelope away. It stayed on the shelf in the machine shed. Gary suggested selling the back cattle and just running the front acreage. No cattle, no water problem. The math made sense. Eldon kept running cattle. Dale Kinzer arrived on a Tuesday morning in September of 1983. He drove a late-model Chevrolet C10 pickup with the Nebraska Rural Water Association logo on the door and a yellow legal pad tucked under one arm. He had been a licensed water systems engineer for 11 years and covered a territory that ran across 6 counties in the southeastern corner of the state. He was 46 years old, broad across the shoulders, with sun-reddened skin on the backs of his hands. It was a cool morning. A light northwest wind moved across the yard. The wheel did not respond to it. The tower legs showed surface rust at the cross bracing, and the red paint on the angle iron had weathered to a dull brown orange over 22 years of Nebraska sun and ice. Kinzer parked at the gate, looked at the tower for about a minute before getting out of the truck. He walked the base of the tower twice, slowly, shielding his eyes to look up at the gearbox housing and the still wheel. He took notes on the yellow pad. He did not climb. He asked Eldon when the mill had last run. July of 1981. 2 years and 2 months. He asked if anything unusual had preceded the failure. Eldon told him about the heat stretch, temperatures above 100 for 5 consecutive days in mid-July, strong south wind the whole time. Kinzer wrote that down, stood there a moment, then told Eldon the gearbox was almost certainly gone. He said the main shaft bearing had likely seized. Heat failed from running dry during the July stretch, possibly after an oil seal had cracked and drained the gearbox of lubrication at some earlier point. He said getting parts for the 702 was difficult. Air Motor had updated their product line. A replacement gearbox assembly, if he could locate one through a parts dealer, would run $340 to $400 before installation. Installation labor on top of that. He also mentioned the tower appeared structurally sound and could accept a newer pump mechanism. He said a modern submersible electric pump off the power pole in the yard was worth considering, given the age of the unit. He left his business card on the fence post by the gate, called the mill scrap metal on his way to the Chevrolet. Charged $65 for the site visit and report. Eldon watched the truck reach the gravel of the county road and turn south toward Highway 50. Stood at the gate another half-minute, looking up at the still wheel and the weathered tower. Then turned and walked to the machine shed. The shed smelled of gear oil and cold iron and old hay compressed into dust. The light came in pale through 2 small windows on the south wall. He went to the 3rd shelf from the top, the shelf where he kept spare parts and chemical supplies, and found what he was looking for. A 1-gallon tin of Pensoil, say 30 non-detergent oil, a half-quart can of kerosene, a strip of leather gasket material he had cut from a worn harness collar in 1976 and set on that shelf in case it proved useful. He put on his gloves, hooked the kerosene can on his belt, took the crescent wrench. He had been climbing this tower since 1963. He knew every rung. 16-inch spacing, 3 8-inch steel rod welded to the inside face of the angle iron legs. He climbed the same way he always had, left hand and left foot leading, body close to the metal, no looking down. In his experience, the people who looked down were the people who came back down quickly. He did not look down. The platform at the top was a grated steel square, 18 inches on a side, bolted to the upper frame just below the gearbox housing. From the platform he could see the full south end of the east pasture, the stock tank dry and pale in the September light, the creek timber a thin brown line at the back edge. The northwest wind moved steadily up there, 10 or 12 miles per hour, enough to have the wheel turning at good speed if the wheel were willing to turn. The gearbox housing was cast iron, about the size of a large cooking pot, bolted to the platform frame. The inspection cover on the near side was held by 4 3/8-inch hex bolts. He had the crescent wrench on them one by one. 2 years of sitting had stiffened the bolts but not locked them. He pulled the cover free. Kinzer had not climbed this tower, had assessed the internal condition of this cast iron gearbox from 33 feet below, in dry grass, with a yellow legal pad. He had written his diagnosis in 20 minutes and driven south toward Highway 50. The main shaft bearing was a bronze sleeve bearing, about 3 inches in diameter, seated in a cast pocket on the left side of the housing. It was coated in a dark, gummy residue, oxidized lubricant that had dried and hardened on all the running surfaces. The bearing was not scored, not cracked. The metal faces showed no heat damage, no melted surfaces, nothing that indicated a failure at the bearing itself. Fouled, not seized. The difference mattered. A seized bearing had failed at the surface, friction welded, metal destroyed. A fouled bearing was locked in place by the adhesion of dried material between moving parts. It would not turn under hand pressure. But the metal was intact. The fill cup, a small brass fitting on the top of the gearbox housing, about the size of a silver dollar, had a rubber disc seal at its base. The seal had cracked in a half circle, probably from 22 years of temperature cycling, heat and cold, expansion and contraction. The crack was visible, a thin black line through the rubber. The gearbox oil had drained through that gap over time, down the inside of the tower, into the ground at the base. The gearbox had been running dry. For how long before July of 1981, Eldon could not say. He poured kerosene into the housing through the cracked fill cup. Let it sit 2 minutes. Then worked the crank pin with the wrench, back and forth, a quarter turn each direction, gradually increasing the arc as the kerosene cut into the dried oil layer. The resistance changed slowly, over about 20 minutes, stiffness becoming drag becoming something with movement in it. He could feel it in his hands the way you feel a fence wire going slack. The main shaft rotated freely at the 35-minute mark. The brake rope was the second issue. On the 702, a tail vane keeps the wheel oriented into the wind for pumping. A side pull rope at the base swings the vane around, furling the wheel to slow or stop it. The rope had been hanging unused for 2 years. It had stretched, then stiffened with cold and damp, and had settled into a position that kept the vane swung about 30 degrees, not fully furled, but enough to kill rotation in anything less than a heavy wind. In the heat of July 1981, there had been strong south wind, but not strong enough to overcome a partial furl combined with a fouled gearbox. The two problems together had stopped the wheel. He adjusted the rope from the platform, taking up 4 inches of slack with a retie through the clevis fitting at the top. The vane moved freely once the rope tension was correct. He climbed back down. Cut the leather strip to fit the fill cup seal, using the cracked rubber piece as a template. Cleaned the groove with the rag from his back pocket. Pressed the leather in. Filled the gearbox through the cup with 30 weight oil from the gallon tin, pouring slow. A full quart went in before the cup stopped taking it. He put the inspection cover back, snugged the bolts. He checked the time when he latched the machine shed. 58 minutes from the first rung to the latched door. There was no wind that afternoon. The wheel sat still in calm air and September light. He went inside, ate dinner. After dinner, Nora asked if it was fixed. He said he thought so, said there was no wind to test it. The wind came up from the northwest around 9:45 that evening. He heard the gearbox working from the bedroom. First a low metallic creak as the wheel found its angle and began to move. Then the steady percussion of the pump rod working up and down, the connecting rod on the crank making its full loop, the pump cylinder pulling and pushing 22 feet below in the dark aquifer. The sound of it was the same sound he had heard almost every night from 1961 to 1981. He lay there listening for a few minutes, got up and walked to the kitchen window. The wheel was turning in the dark, moving at good speed. The tail vane swung full into the northwest wind. The brake rope hung loose and correct from the tower base. He went back to bed. The stock tank in the east pasture was full by the following Thursday. He drove out to check it after dinner and found the overflow pipe running. The tank was at capacity, dumping the excess through the 2-inch overflow into the low side of the pasture. He checked the connecting pipe at the tower base. No seeps. No movement in the joint. He pushed his boot against the pipe fitting at the pump discharge and felt nothing flex. He walked back to the truck. The water hauling stopped. 68 trips. 14 months. Done, he kept a notebook from that point forward. A spiral-bound 70-page pad from the hardware store in Pawnee City. The first entry was September 17, 1983. Oil level good, leather seal seated, pump running. He put the notebook on the third shelf in the machine shed, next to the parts envelope. He started a new entry every spring and every fall when he checked the oil level. The fall passed without incident. The winter of 1983 to 1984 was cold, with 3 weeks of temperatures below zero in January and a ground freeze that went to 32 inches in the low spots. The pump cylinder held. The connecting pipe held. The tank froze on the surface, but the cattle broke through the morning ice on their own, the way cattle do. Eldon checked the gearbox housing in February when the temperature came up to 18 degrees and found no ice damage, no cracked casting. He added a half quart of oil in April, noted it in the notebook. The summer of 1984 was average. The mill pumped without interruption. By 1985, Bud Holloway had a problem. Holloway farmed 480 acres 3 miles northeast across the county road, and he had a 702 of his own, a 1966 model, standing at the corner of his west pasture. It had stopped turning in the spring. Holloway had heard something at the grain elevator in Tecumseh. Eldon never learned the exact words, and came by on a Saturday morning in May of 1985. He said his windmill was down and asked if Eldon would take a look. Eldon drove over that afternoon. The Holloway mill was in better cosmetic condition, less rust on the tower, newer paint, but the symptom was identical. Still wheel, no obvious damage from the ground. He climbed it, opened the inspection cover, and found the same situation. Dry gearbox, the same hardened residue on the bearing surfaces, a cracked fill cup seal of a different rubber type that had failed along the bottom edge. The brake rope had stretched to a similar position. He fixed it in 44 minutes, did not charge for the time. Wrote the oil weight and check interval on a piece of cardboard and left it on the tower base. The Holloway mill ran for 8 years before Bud sold the property. The Streeter operation came in the fall of the same year. A different problem. The Streeters ran 640 acres north of the county road, family land since the 1920s. and their windmill was an older Dempster No. 12, taller tower, different brake configuration, a different vane design than the 702. Eldon spent a full afternoon on it in October of 1985. He found the actual failure by feel more than by sight, running his thumb along the underside of the pitman arm, casting in the shadow of the platform where the afternoon sun could not reach. A hairline crack in the iron. The arm had been flexing on the working stroke and binding on the return, the crack opening a fraction with each cycle, until the bind became worse than the wind could overcome. He replaced the arm with a piece of mild steel flat stock from his shop, heated it in the forge, bent it to angle, drilled the bolt pattern using the old arm as a template. The fit at the upper bearing seat was about a 32nd of an inch off, and he shimmed it with a strip of tin from a coffee can. The mill ran on that repair for 7 years until the Streeter family sold the east ground. The new buyer ran the mill until 1998, when he took the tower down to install pivot irrigation. Eldon's own mill ran clean. He went through 4 spiral notebooks between 1983 and 1995. The entries were brief: a date, an oil level, a note on anything unusual. He replaced the leather fill-cup seal with a proper rubber equivalent in 1986, ordered through a parts catalog out of Hastings. The seal cost $2.40. Shipping was $1.50. He noted the change in the 3rd notebook. In the spring of 1988, the Nebraska Rural Water Association published a bulletin on maintaining older windmill units. Eldon read it when it came in the mail. The bulletin recommended replacing leather seals with rubber equivalents on older 702 models. He had done that in 1986. It also recommended a full gearbox overhaul at 60-month intervals. He was past 60 months without one, and the mill was running clean and tight. He wrote a note in the notebook. Did not write to the Rural Water Association. That summer was a drought summer, one of the worst in 20 years in Pawnee County. The east pasture grass turned gray and dry by the 2nd week of July. Eldon reduced the herd to 31 head to match the carrying capacity of the reduced grass. The mill pulled the aquifer down to 18 feet of drawdown by late August. He measured it by dropping a knotted string down the casing. The pump output stayed above 200 gallons an hour throughout the drought. The aquifer recharged in September, when the rain finally came. The drought of 1988 passed. The mill ran on. In the fall of 1991, a young man from the county extension office came through Pawnee County, doing a water infrastructure survey, a state-level inventory of functioning windmill systems. He arrived on a cool November morning with a clipboard and a 35mm camera. He photographed the tower, the gearbox housing, the pump base, and the connecting pipe. Measured the tower height, asked when the mill had last been serviced. Eldon told him. The young man asked who had done the repair work in September of 1983. Eldon said he had. The young man asked what the prior diagnosis had been. Eldon told him that too. The young man was quiet for a moment. He said the Rural Water Association's site visit record from September of 1983 showed the unit as non-functional, with a recommendation for decommissioning. Eldon said that was right. The young man looked at the wheel turning in the November wind. He wrote something on his survey form. He did not say what. He left a copy of the documentation with Eldon before driving out of the yard. Eldon filed it with the notebooks on the 3rd shelf. The mill ran through the winters of 1992, 1993, and 1994 without significant trouble. The pump cylinder ice locked in January of 1994 during a stretch of -22 weather. Eldon poured 3 gallons of hot water down the casing and worked the pump rod from the base until the cylinder freed. Lost 1 day of pumping. The tank ran on reserve, He laid the mill down in the spring of 1995 for a full overhaul, the only time he took it completely apart in the 16 years after the initial repair. He ordered both main bearings and the pitman arm assembly from the air motor catalog. The catalog address had come from a man at the Pawnee County Fair who serviced windmills out of Crete. The parts order totaled $118. Shipping was $14. He had the mill back up in 3 days and painted the tower legs with red iron oxide primer, the same shade they had been when Rupert Shield put the mill up in 1961. The summer of 1996 was the hardest since 1936 in parts of the county. The temperature at the grain elevator in Tecumseh hit 107 on the afternoon of July 19th. 3 farms in Pawnee County that had converted to electric submersible pumps lost water service during a 20-hour period when the Rural Electric Cooperative ran rolling brownouts to manage grid load across the district. Livestock went without water in the worst heat of the year. One hog operation north of the county line lost animals. Eldon's East pasture tank ran at 2/3 full through the worst of it. The 702 did not use the cooperative's grid. It used the southwest wind, which ran at 14 miles per hour on the afternoon of July 19th, while the electric pumps sat idle waiting for power. He did not mention this at the cooperative meeting in September. He had a clear opinion about it. He kept it in the 5th notebook. In November of 1998, Nora asked him over the kitchen table how long the old windmill had been running since he fixed it. He thought about it, said 15 years. She said she thought it was more than that. He got the first notebook from the machine shed shelf and opened to the first page. September 17th, 1983. He counted on the calendar. 15 years. 2 months. She said that was a long time for a piece of scrap metal. He agreed that it was. He sold the east 160 acres to Harlan and Deborah Frisch of Wayne County in October of 1999. He was 80 years old. His knees had been unreliable since 1996, and the tower climb twice a year had become a project he planned around instead of just doing. He sold the mill with the land, along with both stock tanks, the connecting pipe, the pump assembly, and the 5 spiral notebooks on the machine shed shelf. He spent an afternoon going through the notebooks with Harlan Frisch. Showed him the oil check procedure, where the fill cup was on the gearbox housing and how to read the level. Showed him the brake rope adjustment and how to test vane tracking in a crosswind. Showed him the drawdown numbers he had recorded through the 1988 drought. He wrote the air motor catalog address on the inside cover of a 6th blank notebook and left it on the shelf with the others. Left the leather seal stock too, most of a strip still remaining from 1976. Harlan Frisch said he had never maintained a windmill before. Eldon said most of it was oil and attention. The Frisches kept cattle on the East 160 for 11 more years. The mill ran through most of that time, pumping the same sandstone aquifer that had never gone dry, watering cattle in the same 2-tank system Eldon had expanded in 1987. The wheel needed a new vane in 2004. The original vane had cracked along the mounting bracket from metal fatigue, 43 years of wind load. A replacement pump cylinder cup in 2007. Both repairs were carried out following the notebook entries, with parts from the air motor catalog. Eldon drove past the property on a March afternoon in 2006. He was coming back from Tecumseh, where he had gone to a pharmacy appointment. The county road ran along the west edge of the old East 160, and from the road the mill tower was visible against the pale sky. 200 yards in, the wheel was turning in a southwest wind, slow and steady. The tail vane swung correctly into it. The red paint on the tower legs showed against the dormant brown grass. He slowed the truck, looked at the wheel turning, drove on. The 5 notebooks and the blank 6th notebook and the leather seal stock on the 3rd shelf stayed in the machine shed when Harlan Frisch sold the property in 2010. A grain farmer from Richardson County bought the ground. He found the notebooks when he was cleaning the shed on a cold afternoon in November, sitting on a 5-gallon bucket with the notebooks on his knee, reading the first one cover to cover. The mill was still standing, still turning in the November wind. The first entry in the first notebook read, September 17, 1983, oil level good, leather seal seated. Pump running. 1 hour of work on a gearbox a licensed engineer had declared scrap without opening. 16 years of water. A leather seal cut from an old harness collar. A gallon of 30 weight oil. Still pumping. Still working. Still there.